Yeah. 다들이 시번니 유타르치모 밑에 접어봐 와서
Today is the fourth one, replying to objections that final transformation is not possible.
다디 접어 용해디 가르래 가정기 댄시 교공발레 예바 말루버 빵때 니 유타르치모 토바 규이 시세기다 어디 니 유타르치모 아세요 어디 접어들지.
So this is a debate or an objection in relation to the original reason that was given, that with familiarization, final transformation there is final transformation, and so this is objection to the fact that final transformation is not possible.
거지기지로와 다 거지기자와 개된니 규르자 람신 균이 중시나스.
And so here the objection of the opponent is, although there is transformation, like the path, faults too will arise.
제바 다메도베 셰럽기 리시 녜바 빵데 네 규르장스. 람메비 규라 람중와 신도 녜바메비 규라 균이 중우 셰나스.
And so the commentary says, if you say the wisdom realizing selflessness can lead to transformation, which here is, they're saying, temporarily remove faults, just like the path that can manifest in the mind of one who does not have the path, even in a continuum without faults, errors can manifest.
다 저바디 가르레세 용도 저바 디니스 고람니 녜중당 녜진도 미티베 저바오스.
And so this objection is an objection that is addressing the fourth aspect of the truth of cessation and the fourth aspect of the path. That's why over here it says, this is the objection that cessation and the path are not definitive emergence, which is the fourth aspect of cessation, and definitive deliverance, which is the fourth aspect of the path.
다 디기 렌텔라 자와 마이 누바 메체로스.
And the reply is, it is not so because it does not have the ability.
제바 다메도베 셰럽기 니규르 타르침베 셈라 녜바기베 누바 메비체로스.
A mind that has undergone complete transformation by the wisdom realizing selflessness does not have the ability to give rise to faults.
다디 가리숭고르시디 다메도베 셰럽기 데네 당진 사변의 제바 파 세버 제차나 딘디기 셈텔라 라양 아니 녜바 차수 기기르베스는 기기 말이스 다 기기 누바 요 말이스 마이 누바 메체로 세도 디송비요.
So what it's saying here is, when a mind has undergone complete transformation through the wisdom of selflessness to a point where it has removed the afflictions and also the seed of afflictions, at that point the mind no longer has the ability to give rise to faults.
다디 김젠텔라 안 당보 베이팅니 디시경거리 베이팅니 셈기랑 신셰바다 아니 티멀루부베 베직시기르와 어디인디 베이팅니 셈기랑 신셰바스.
And then to prove this point, it does so by proving it through an example, and through this example it's explaining why it is the nature of the mind to be able to attain such final transformation, and it does this through an example. So for that it says, to prove this reason that it does not have the ability to give rise to faults, it explains the nature of the mind through an example.
자와 남시 유진바이 추 제대로 여든 진바당 여바이네 다니테 디 깨버 체방 인스.
Apprehension of an object is a property of consciousness. It apprehends just as it exists. The nature of an existent is also the producer of this.
다 단다데 지강 당보치도와 남시 이준바이 추 세시도와 다 베디 가월 송구여르세디 베디 베나 미긴 남시기 율카레 유 수그루와 다 미시기 수기 깨지진 거와 디인디 미긴 남시기 율 숙짐바니 숙짐바 징고르와 다디 짐바디 가르레 Zimbati yugi rangshin the tumber shubare, mitumber shubares lana, yugi rangshin da tumber shubares. Di indu migi namshigi yusu zimbani yugi rangshin the tumber shuba yindes. Diche.
So the first line here, which is apprehension of an object. I was told the word apprehension is not necessarily the best, but it doesn't mean to be apprehensive, right? You know what it's being used in this context, right? So apprehension of an object is a property of consciousness. But this first line, what it's saying through the example over here, is that it is using the example of an I consciousness that engages in matter or form source, and using this I consciousness as an example of something that engages in form source. What it's saying over here is the property of this consciousness or I consciousness is to apprehend its object, and the object that it apprehends is form source, and because the object that it apprehends exists or is concordant with the way it exists, the way the I consciousness apprehends it is also in concordance with how the object exists.
Ta yugi rangshin the tumber shuba yinde kyugi suk chitar yoba di zimbishers.
And so that's why in the commentary it says the apprehension of the object form by I consciousness engages in concordance with the nature of the object, and the reason is because it apprehends form just as it exists.
Ta dis zawa tsigang nibadi chitar yote zimba thang se di sungore.
So the apprehends form just as it exists is the second line of the root verse.
Ta digi tsigang tinyibu digi teni sem ti rangshin yinos. Sidu kangla ani yugi ngobe nisu de tumbar semgi yutela shubadi semgi rangshin res. Ta tangbudi dishi di gyongore.
So then it says, and this itself, that is the nature of the mind. What it means here is that the nature of the mind, or nature here in the sense its quality, what it is, what it does. So not in that ultimate sense, but just the nature of the mind is to be something that apprehends things in a way that concords with how they exist.
Ta yule yube dani ki suk tes. Ta tanda mishigi suk zimba di ani yugi rangshin do tumba res keja she yundu ani yule yube rangshin karere suk dire do wa. Tende ki suk digi mikin sheje suk kebar mishi kebar shaba di ani suk digi rangshin re. Yulti rangshin yinos.
And so this is, the first part is addressing what the nature of consciousness is. Now the second part is addressing what the nature of its objects are. And so the nature of the object of I consciousness, which is form, is to act as an objective condition and produce an I consciousness or produce consciousness that perceives it as it is. So the nature of the object is to produce consciousness that perceives that object as that object exists.
So zata di tanda dela yugi rangshin chinda semgi rangshin ni sheje. Ani yugi rangshin she yundu sugi jeje yul sugi jeje te ani korangi mijin chini sugi edi sugzim mishiki edi ani kebarche edi yuldi korangi rangshin res. Daana shingi semtegi migi sheba tegi ani yugi rangshin da tumbar takda zinyati semtegi rangshin res. Tanda di keje she. Di nyibu su dom yungdu tena lo te yugi niluk da tumbar shubha yinbe simgyu la telmi rungwa yinos.
So when you have form, or here form source more specifically, form source as a quality that is like almost inherent to it, it is inherent to it, that quality that is inherent to form or is the nature of form is to act as an objective condition that produces consciousness that perceives form. That's what form does. That's the nature of form source. And so that's the nature of the object. Then there is the thing that perceives that form, which in this case is I consciousness. And the nature or the inherent property of I consciousness is to perceive form as it is. And so the nature of the objects is to produce perceptions of those objects as they are. That's an inherent nature of objects. And the nature of consciousness, which is an inherent nature of consciousness, is that it perceives the object as it is. Which is why the last part of the commentary says, the nature of form of the object produces it, that is the nature of the object, and then, therefore, because cognition engages with its object in concordance with the way it exists, it is inseparable from the continuum of the mind. So this nature of perceiving its object in concordance with the way it exists is a nature that is inseparable from the continuum of the mind.
Tadi semgi rangshingi peche. Ta luburu pe khareslamna tsawa rangshin di in dile te kenshin kini kolgyurshin dogba lani kenla te midin dulgi loshinos.
And then there is the stating an example of something adventitious. So there's two parts. What is nature? And then what is the meaning of adventitious? And so now giving an example of what is adventitious, it says, this is the nature, the previous one. Other conditions make it deviate from this. Reversing them relies on conditions like the unstable cognition of a snake.
Deba. Takdala dunzingi wangshe tabuni yugi rangshin de tumbar shukba mayinde kyoge takta chidar yoba de zimba mimbichirs.
Consciousness like the I consciousness that apprehends a rope as a snake does not engage in the nature of the object in a concordant manner because it does not apprehend the rope in the way that it exists.
Lo teni semla mitemba luburwa yindes. Rawa miten dulgi loshinu segi dulgi loshinu sedi pesungu yoba yindu takwa duzingi keje dishe. Ta miten la yindu tetabu takwa la duldu zimbi lo teni semla mitemba semgi rangshin mayibas. Luburwa yinde yugi rangshin tela kinshingi chinju lodo kolwa gyuwa kanshi yugi rangshin tona kyo dogwa gyuwa chiros.
So this form of cognition, you should just put this form of cognition, I think, is not stable for consciousness. So this way of perceiving or this way of cognizing things is not a stable property of cognition, of consciousness, and is adventitious because other conditions have made it mistakenly deviate from the nature of that object, and if the nature of the object is seen, it will be reversed.
Tadi tsawa tsigang thangpo sumdigi tenga ore rangshin diin dilete kenshin gini kolgyurshin se yugi rangshin tela kenshin gi chinjulo do kowa gyuwa kanshi yugi rangshin tona ni kyo dogba gyuwa shiro se dogba lani kenla se odisungi yore.
So these are the first three lines which say this is the nature, this is the nature of consciousness. Other conditions make it deviate from this, which means if consciousness does not act in accordance with what its nature is, that is because other conditions have made it deviate from such nature or from such a state, and then reversing these, so to reverse this change that has arisen, it relies on conditions. So reversing them relies on conditions. This is the first three lines.
Tadi dus chichi kongba shenamba. Takbala takba zimbi mishishe, takbala duldu zimbi mishishe. Ni chik chinju logo lo che, ani chik jugu la matu yubda, sheba tundun set, lo tundun set geji chaderwa. Di indu ta takwa zimbi mishi di, takwa zimbi mishi di, ani korang semgi rangshin resi du ta sem da tirung ma resi. Tadi ko semgi rangshin korang res geje dishe. Takwa la duldu zimbi mishi di semgi rangshin ma res. Ta chik semgi rangshin ma res geje she yundu ani di gyumzen del kare ko yore. Takwa zimbi mishi di semgi rangshin yibi gyumzen kare takwa chidara yoba nashin zimbi shirs. Resuma. Chima di semgi rangshin ma yibi gyumzen kare re 아니 타고 치더 여번나시 미징바 텔로 도드 짐비시르스 로와 큐게 타고 치더 여번데 짐모 마임비시르스 또 균진 팁다.
So if you consider two examples, one is eye consciousness that sees a snake, sees a rope to be a snake, and then another eye consciousness that sees a rope to be a rope. What is being said here is the eye consciousness that sees a rope as a rope is of the nature of that consciousness, or is the nature of that mind. The eye consciousness that sees a rope to be a snake is not of the nature of the mind. And the reason that is being given in the case of seeing a rope as a rope is, take the eye consciousness that sees the rope to be a rope, it follows it is inseparable from the mind, or it is an inseparable nature of the mind, because it apprehends its object in concordance with how it exists, or concordantly with how it exists. And the other one, which is the eye consciousness that apprehends a rope to be a snake, it follows it is not an inseparable nature of the mind, because it apprehends its object in a way that does not concord with how it exists. So these are the two reasons that have been given.
다 대한하신 유강로 마케제 셰윤디 탁바기 탁바 준비 미식개버 쳬바디 탁바 고랑게 라시레 탁바기 둘두 준비 미식개버 쳬디 탁베기 랑시 마레스.
So that's with respect to with the consciousness, or the one that perceives the object. Then there is the nature of the object itself, and the nature of the rope is to produce eye consciousness that perceives it as a rope. The nature of the rope is not to produce an eye consciousness that sees the rope as a snake.
다 탁바기 둘두 준비 미식개디 아니 탁바 고랑게 랑시 마임바 인디 긴 신기 원기 탁바 둘두 준비로디 깨고와 딘디기 낀디 도소나 아니 탁발라 둘통로디 아니 셈다 카테르지 셈다 카테르지 고 매버 차르지 디인디 긴신기니 고주신 독발라니 겐라 되세 디레 다 탁발라 탁바 좀 미시게디 긴신기 원기 탁바 통기 요 말에 그런 탁 우빈이줄 그런 탁바 임버 디기 탁바 통기 요바 인디 고 탁바 그런 매버 마차기 봐도 디즘 미시디 아니 셈다 카테예요.
So because the nature of the rope is to produce consciousness that sees a rope, but in situations where the rope is seen as a snake, there is a condition that has intervened that is not natural to that rope, and therefore because there has been some other condition that has intervened and has deviated the perception of a rope from its original nature, when that condition is reversed, the perception of the rope will return to what the original nature of that rope was, which was to be seen as a rope, and for the eye consciousness to see a rope as a rope. That's what over here is saying, where it's saying reversing them relies on conditions. No, other conditions make it deviate from this. Reversing those conditions relies on further conditions. So what it's saying is when the conditions that have made it deviate from this will be removed or reversed, then the perception will be of what it is. And what the perception of what it is just a perception of a rope. And that perception cannot be altered. Until that rope exists as a rope, that perception is the nature of that rope, and the nature of the perception is going to be to perceive that rope. That cannot be altered.
So that dilabdi thagwa zimbi mishike di yudi korong ngobeni zula thagwa yimba digi mishike bi mijin chigi yormato ani yudi thagwa mayimba kin shemba chigi tini shugengi wangi 아니 탁월 통니 미시디 깨버 말레스 디 인디 유 코롱 오벤주 카리 임바 대도 툼바 코롱 슈크데바디 인디 코 셈다 체룽기 루부와 사이드 말레스 긴싱기 또 중샤바디 마인디 루부와 말레스 베나 추장무디 추코랑 랑싱 장무 임바 디 김쟁이 장무 깨저레 마도 코 랑싱 장무 마임바 루부르도 규진 셈바지기 관계 장무 수여샤바디 말와스 베티나시데스
So what it's saying therefore is the fact that the rope is seen as a rope does not require some other conditions or does not require secondary conditions for the rope to be seen as a rope. The rope being seen as a rope or the rope being perceived as a rope and the eye consciousness being perceived, the eye consciousness perceiving it as a rope is an inherent quality of these two things. It doesn't rely on other conditions. Therefore, because it doesn't rely on other conditions for it to be perceived as a rope, the perception of a rope as a rope is not adventitious. That's the example that's being used. Because it doesn't rely on later conditions or other conditions, it being perceived as a rope is not adventitious. It is natural to it. It is its nature. For example, water being cool is not something that requires conditions to act on the water to make its temperature like that, but it is inherent. It is the nature of water to be like that. And so the water being cool is not something that is adventitious or relies on other conditions, but it is the nature of water itself.
다 탁발라 둘도 통화돼 탁발라 둘도 통화돼 탁바 코론 둘 임비 줌생기 둘즈미 미시께바 마임바 깨바 마임바 인디 탁바 코란게 랑싱기 통네 둘즈미 미시께버 치기요 말이스 소자다 텔라 둘도 통화디 아니 규진 셴바치기 아니 받코론 틀쇼제 모비니즈도 통화로 봐딥 모비니즈 마임바치 고 규진 셴바치기 봐디 제제 아니 둘도 봐 통주고 유바 인디 딘디기 로디 가르차바래라나 간조 추기 랑신디 차와 마이나야 루부르도 규진 셴바게 와요 고 차우스여바나시 차데바디 인디 고 루부르 와레스 스윈디 인디다 랑신 가리임바 텔레 독데 바 통주에디 고 루부르와 긴 셴바지기 지기 여바 인디 딘디기 낀디 바 세르디 그런게 랑신 고마 가리임바 디 통을로 디야게로 와 디인디 둘도 짐바디 루부르와 차디 그래서 어디 숨겨요.
However, in situations where the rope then looks like a snake or is perceived to be a snake, that perception of the rope as a snake is not natural, or it's not the nature of that rope. It has required some other condition or some other cause that has somehow kind of added itself to the natural state and has made the thing deviate from what it is. And so, because its appearance as a snake is not the natural state of that rope, or is not the natural state of the perception of the perceiver, but it has been altered because of the addition of some other cause or some other condition, we call, in English you'll also find temporary, but adventitious, temporary might be misleading because it might just sound like it's impermanent. It just means that it is a deviation from a natural state by other conditions. So that's what we're trying to say when we say adventitious. Is that okay? Yeah? So when what we're saying here is the deviation from its natural state is a adventitious state. And it's adventitious because what's happening is not natural or inherent to the rope, nor is it natural or inherent to the consciousness. Therefore, the eye consciousness perceiving that rope as a snake is not the natural state of that eye consciousness. It's like water whose natural state is not to be hot, but because of some other later conditions, it has become hot. And when those conditions are removed or reversed, it will return to its natural state. Similarly, the perception of a snake is not the natural state of consciousness. Something has made it do that, which is later adventitious conditions. So we say it's an adventitious property of seeing a snake, which when those conditions are removed, it will return back to its original natural state.
다 당기 추기 빼디가 샤바나 신체 추디 그런 추신 소럽체 다 디기 랑신디 정모체 디기 랑신 정모체 아니 규긴 심바 망고지 겐체제 코 차우스여바이나 코 장모디 매바스여지 차우스여바이나 난 추딜로 되게 랑신 여딩이 차베 랑신 차와레디에 찍도와 디인도다 추딜라 장외 랑신직 추딜라 차베 랑신직 니 통야도와 다니 통야 여베 낭로네 추디기 랑신 오마 가르레스 계제 샤가르디 랑싱 오마디 아니 메당지 처우 마수베 공기 코로나랑 가리 통대바 디 주디기 랑싱 오마디레스 디 인도 장모디체 처우디 랑싱 오마디 말레스 코 루브르도 규진 셴바 메딘데 땅체 코 처우 쇠샤바디 인디 아니 메디 시소나 양 코랑싱디 파도체 장모로 파 규르고 요바 인디 차와디 아니 주디기 루브르 랑싱레스 랑싱 오마디 말레스 루브르 와디레스 아니 랑싱 오마디 가레레스라나 장모디레스 오다 디 페체.
So the example, again, if you will, with water, there's another way of talking about it, which is water, when it gets hot, it takes on a nature of being hot. So the subject is water. Let's take the subject being water. And then this water, in certain situations, has a cool nature. And in other situations, it takes on a warm or a hot nature. But if you are wondering which one of these two states or which one of these two natures are its actual state or its actual nature, the one that is its actual nature is the one that does not need or the one that does not arise through other conditions that act upon it. So the nature of it being cool is its actual nature, because for it to have taken on a hot nature, it required fire or some source of heat to act upon it, which then made it hot. And so even though it might show a nature of being hot, when you're seeing what its actual nature is, the actual nature is the one that exists as a property of it without requiring adventitious conditions or temporary conditions to act upon it, which is why then when the fire goes out, it returns to its original state, and that earlier state of heat, it gets reversed. So with that as a subject and these two states that it takes on, which is its actual state or which is its actual nature, is checked in this manner. So this is the example.
베티나 신체제다 셈디 추진라샤 티니 셈디기 유기 무빈뉴스 통화 찍다 야 유기 무빈뉴스 마통와 셰제 친주로도 통대와 셈라 키주 디니도와 키주 디니 요바 유드 다 키주 디니기 나니 셈게 랑싱 오마디 카레레스 셈게 랑싱 오마디 카레레스 유기 무빈뉴스 통대와디 셈게 랑싱 오마르베 유 친주로도 통대와디 셈게 랑싱 오마레스 디케제 지용디 유무빈니스 강 통대바디 아니 셈게랑 싱고마디레스 루브르 친주로도 통대바디 셈게랑 싱고마마리 디 루브르와레스 디 루브르와 투비 유딘데 투규 셴기 왕기 아니 루브르도 코 무빈니스도 마통지 친주로도 출대바레 마도 디 친주로도 짐바디 셈고랑게랑 싱고마디 마레스 남시기세 투비 유디 세르디 아니 유경고빈도 가리 임바 대가라는 거는 셈디 도스 통도에디 셈고랑게랑 신고마 입다 되레스 더 베딘도스 잡도.
So that's the example. How you connect the example to what is being addressed here is the same way that you've taken the subject water in the first case. Now the subject is the mind, and the two states that you see it have, or the two natures that it seems to. Is it okay to use state and nature interchangeably? Yeah. The two states or the two, we'll use nature because the text says nature. The two natures that it has, one is apprehending things as they are, and the other one is apprehending things incorrectly. Like the two states or the two natures of water, one which is hot and one which is cool. Similarly, these are the two states that the mind exists in, or the two natures that it manifests. Of these two, which one is the actual nature of the mind and which one is not the actual nature of the mind? The one that does not require adventitious later temporary conditions for it to perform that function or for it to have that state, that is the actual nature or actual state of the mind. The one that requires adventitious conditions to act upon it and make it do that thing or take that state, take on that nature, that is not its actual nature. And so of these two, when one looks and sees which is the one that is natural to the mind, The one that is natural is seeing things as they are. And seeing things or apprehending things inaccurately is something that arises or is a state that the mind takes on when it has been acted upon by adventitious conditions. So that's the example of the water as the subject and the two states that are hot and cool, and testing which one is the natural state and which one is not an actual state or not a natural state or not really its nature is similar to taking the mind as the subject and then seeing whether accurately apprehending its object or inaccurately apprehending its object, which one of these is its actual nature. That's how the example is used to connect it to the thing at hand, the discussion here.
다 당기 빼디강라 다 추디 아니 장모만이 버텐도 쇠 여러베스 세직다 추디 사우만이 버쇠 여러베스 그래서 기시 사와디 추기 랑신이나 추디 사와만이 버텐도 사와만이 버쇠 여말 그 루브 내갑 사와만이 버소 초고 유래 빼다 장로나 다지 장모 쇠 초고 유래 이나 코라 랑신 뭐마디 차와이나 땐도 차와만이 버쇠요 말이 땐도 차와만이 버쇠요 여러서나 요 말이 봐. 다 알레다무디 지와 당신은 가지고 세우차기로 와. 기시 추디기 랑신 뭐마디 장모이나 아니 추디 땐도 세고다. 내가 장모만이 뭐 말다. 땐도 장모만이 버쇠 소초구를 베스. 소에지 용초구를 베스. 지와 당나.
So if we ask a question and the question is, if the actual nature of water was to be cool, can you make the water definitively not cool? So what we're saying is, definitively not cool doesn't mean that you can't make it not cool in certain moments. What we're asking is, if the nature of water is to be cool, its actual nature is to be cool, can you make the coolness of water permanently go away? That's what we're asking. So what would you say?
No. 다 디나신 직바로 와. 기시 추기 랑신 뭐마디 차와이나 아니 내가 좀 많이 땐도 추디 차와만이 버쇠 여러베스.
It's the same thing then. So if the nature of water was to be hot, even though sometimes temporarily you may be able to make it not hot, can you make it permanently? And permanently means here enduringly, forever not hot. Can you do that if its nature was to be hot?
봐. 다 추기랑신 뭐마디 장모이나 장모디 땐도 장모 많이 버쇠면도 봐. 이나야 추디 내가 차와 그룹이나 딘데기 차와디 아니 땐도 차와 많이 버소 초구로 초구 말해.
땐도 차와 많이 버. So if the nature of water is not to be hot but it is to be cool, then when it does become hot sometimes, at that point when it becomes hot, is it possible to make that hot nature of water permanently not hot at that point?
수행이 초구로 초구 말해.
Can you?
초구 말했어. 가르친 초구 말해.
Why can't you?
맞다. 차와디 추기 디마다 랑신 뭐뭐 많이 고 루브도 내가 차와쇠 내가 차와쇠 셔주 디기 차와디 안 디기 추디 땐도 차와 많이 버쇠 여려 말.
Is the question clear? Yeah. If you take water and you make it hot, which is not its actual nature, when you take and you make it hot, which is not its actual nature, but it takes on that nature of being hot, can you make that nature of it being hot go away permanently? Can you make it permanently not hot?
Permanently from the water.
Yeah. Can you make that water permanently not hot?
추디로 배 차와기 랑신디 배 거를 메워서 줘야 여려 말.
Just yes and no.
그럼 no sir.
No.
If no, why?
Okay, if no, then why am I translating?
Huh?
Huh? What? कोई योसा दिल ला लेंगे
아,
कोई योसा दिल ला लेंगे
간디사.
ku khori khawa ta saja khawa la le male de la rale
쿠리 계자 말도 추 고란라 랑신 디 메바 스웨 요르요 말세 땐도 메바 스웨 요르요 말세
chibodir so yo mar khajine jemati khorang ke tan thebe saja ji la lena khoran sing chao cha
따디 라바이나 가르쳐 버래 탁바디 둘기 랑신 마레스 이네 탁바 둘도 통해데 까투에요 마레스 내가 까 쇼거데 야 제마 긴 심바스네 탁바 둘랑자 통데 그레스 빼지고 차 버봐
so then at that point then essentially what that thought is saying is that even though the nature of the rope is not to be seen as a snake, when you reverse the perception of the rope as a snake, later on when those conditions will come back, again you will see it as a snake, which means that you can never counter the perception of the rope as a snake. That would be the example, right?
다 디나시 풍불로 다도 통해디 풍불로 라와에 다도 통해디 내가 까초 그랬어. 이네 풍불로 다도 통로디 땐도 매버 소투 그랬어. 소투 말했어. 야 제마 로게 제마 고 유진디 소소나 야 풍불로 다도 통로디랑자 깨요 그랬어. 어디디 커지기 되다. 커지기 되고 딱딱 되시네.
그 가정도 버티.
라
그런 가정도 버티.
어디 커지기 되고 버티.
So the same thing then would be that you can see the aggregates as a self, which is not the nature of the aggregates, but you can't permanently remove the perception of the aggregates as a self, because when the conditions come back, you can temporarily prevent seeing a self, but you can't permanently remove that. So that's the view of the opponent over here. Is it clear that they're the same? The view of the opponent?
맞다. 추디 랑신 차우 마인 바체 다 메당지 차우스여로 와. 다 메당지 차우스여인데 추디를 죄래서 와. 다 덴데 죄디 아니 추디다 덴도 카테바 쇠 여르베스. 덴도 카테바 쇠 여르베스. 쇠 여다메 소투마도 지와 니 카바로 와. 쇠 여르요 말스. 쇠 요 말스. 가르치나나 내가 메디시제 그 정무 차바 있나 양 젤 연결 몇 발초로 삼루디로 와 젤 연결 규기 몇 소소나 양 고랑자 차우 양 차우스에 두었어 디 균쟁게 아니 땐도 코 정무 땐도 정무관 대지 디 용식이 말했어 랍초나 아니 셰바디 땐도 담에갈 대바디 용초고 말해 단단 내가 담에갈 대바 있나 양 제마 다도 티비 규소소나 양 고들이 쇼고 왔어 지워지 거리
So it's actually the same, because if you think about so the question is not, can you do it? Like, can you take water and make it not hot? We're not asking that. Is it possible? Is it possible for the nature of water to be separated from the nature of being hot? Not, can you do it or not? And if the thought behind why the nature of water cannot be separated from heat is because later on, if you was to come into contact with conditions such as fire, it would return to being hot, then the mind can be made temporarily free from perceiving and grasping at a self, but later on, when conditions come about, or the causes for it to perceive the self come into contact with it again, it will perceive the self again. That's how this is the same. Is it the same? What's the difference? Should saboranshin chaya chigi ken la rale gires. Sheba dangdu zingeri chigi
nangi gires. Chig chilogi gyugengi chigidu, chig nangi gyugengi chigidu so. Tadi gyugengi chida nangi geja sherimado, rodan chibarwa. Rangshin tida katiya yunguri yungu marisa rangshin.
So the causes or conditions that alter it being external, internal might be different. But the fact that its nature is permanently removable from one or not, depending on causes, that much is still the same. There's no difference between those two.
양계직 삼다다. ngobu theta thegi rangshin mayin bache ngobo theda degi rangshin mayim bajik negab chigla ko rangshin tawo ya changle sona dindi rangshin di ngobo degi rangshin ngoma mare dela kharsigre zuma di zuma yimba yindu dindi di kharre dindi di ta ngobo theda khatiye yori yomares dendu khatiye yori yomares keje she yungdi ani khatiye yores korangi rangshin mayin chinjela kharre khatiye yores 다 카티와 소투 마둘레 니주 카가시 이네 랑신 가레레 카티에 요레스 된 카티에 김젠 가레라나 디코기 랑신 마레스 루부르도 상대가 되레스 다 ngo부테다 디기 랑신 인친젤라 가리먹고 가리체바는 카티와 수에 요 마레스 빼나 수미다바 마임바 수에 요레스나 수에 요 마레스 가지나나 랑신레스 수고랑게 랑신인디 카티에 산에 수에 요 마레스 당가서 가정 계제 셔야 되더라. 가정 가지 개원 가지 주비 계제 셔야 되거든. 다가랑 계제 셔와. 기시 셔바디 수기 랑신 임바이나 아니 수도 셔바니디 카트해요 말이지. 수 매바차나 셔바 매바차고래. 셔바유는 수기요 그래. 군이 파주 직용이 직로사요 말. 고 랑신 대가나 있나. 다수 셔바디 수기 랑신 마힘바 송자 수도 카트해요레스. 수 매바이나야 셔발레가 제 초구레스. 가지라는 So
if you think about nature, think about it like this. Take something and see whether the state that it has is a state that is kind of inherent to it, or it is a state that comes on later, relies on some other conditions to make it take on that state. And in situations where it takes on that state because of other conditions or other causes, then that is called a false state. It's a fake state. It's not its real state. Now the question is, if something is a false state or it is a fake state, can that be removable? Not is one able to remove it or am I able to do it or not, but as its nature, as the thing exists, is that state removable? And what's being said is that state is removable because it is not inherent to it. It has come about through later causes. While saying this, it's also saying those states that are inherent to it, those are not removable. They're not separable states from that thing. So is it separable is a different question from am I able to separate it or not? And what's being said is, if the state that it has is inherent to it or is a natural state, then it's not separable. Everything that comes about through later causes is a separable state, independent of whether one is able to do it or not. And this is the same thing, for instance, when you say form cannot be separated from being impermanent. It is an inseparable state from impermanence because it is inherent to it. Its becoming impermanent doesn't come about through other conditions. It's an inherent state to it. This is also the same reason that we saw in the section on rebirth, which said, if the nature of matter and consciousness are the same, if they are of one state, then they are inseparable. But the reason why here we're saying consciousness and matter are separable is because they're not of one state. The state of matter is not conscious. The state of consciousness is not material. The nature of these two is not the same. That's why they're separable. So try and think about it like that and see what happens.
다양한 두스 공부시나 야구요. 당한조 미조방에 바 통해요래. 야 미조바 상부 통해요. 와. 밀 니가 통해도 와. 소소 미기 내셔 가래. 조방에 바 들베 조바 야구들이.
So another way to think about it is if you see someone who is like badly behaved, or another person who's well behaved, which one of these two is the natural state of the person?
양 디니가 많이 봐야 미그랑신 가가지요.
Or is there another state that is the natural state of that person?
당아주 지시자가들이 미수소 소설 자기로 와. 미수소 미디랑신 연바요르스. 미디랑신 상보요르스 이제. 미 코랑이 미 제라바 코랑 되시 얘기로 와. 미 제라바 코랑 되시 얘기하고 와시. 간주 미 밀 랑신 상와 통해도 연바에 통해도 와. So di into the mi korangi nature ngoma de kharida. Sangbodire nyembadire.
So generally when we say this person is badly behaved is not the right word to translate. It is good or bad. Can we just go like that? Yeah. If we say this person is good or they have like a bad nature, or this person has a good pure nature, that's when you're talking about individual people. So leave that individual specific situation aside and just see people or humans. Humans sometimes have good natures or sometimes they don't. Which one is the nature of humans?
Di lauro di malano hoblar.
You have to say that. Otherwise you lose all hope.
Otherwise we will lose the hope. Kiti migi rangshin dukja ina tangazo di nashin ro rangshin dukja yimba ji dukja ma yimba sue try che de ro rangshin midaba yimba ji midaba ma yimba sue try che de nashin tangazo kubo uzu ge.
Because otherwise it's going to be like trying to impose a nature that is not natural to people by trying to make them good. Kind of like forcing form to be permanent when its nature is not there.
다 당기 di nashin chudi be tendo chau sue ge bezun che no nashin ta. Chudi rangshin thongo che tendo chau sue ge bezun che de ta me baba ba de.
It's like having to make fire constantly hot. So you have to make sure that water is constantly hot. So it's kind of like trying to force water to be always hot by always sitting there and keeping it alight with fire.
다 미기 rangshin di ngembe tanda ngembe chachido kumshi ngemba chido 미기 rangshin di maina ta ngazu midi yabu se kokob yorta.
So if the nature of people or the human nature is not like bad or mean or whatever, then there's room for trying to intervene and do something and fix it.
So zata rangshin ngemba di midi ki rangshin maina ngemba du lubur du gyujing chungba yende ta gyujing de zo kaya ki tabshi sheja ani midi rangshin ngoma kana pa loya ge kokab ngazu chego orwa di cheba nashi dumri thongo orwa ani ngazu sangi geje di dinishin lep yorwa.
So the reason why we say that the nature is good is because it not being good or not being pure has come about through later causes and conditions, which is why then by acting on those causes and acting on those adventitious conditions that have come together, these temporary conditions, one can return it to its original state, and that's why we also speak of the possibility of Buddhahood.
Tadi gongba shewar kyanzo rangshin du lubu wa sedi rangshin yin so na rangshin yin bu ji mani ti rangshin le pa negap do ni uzu gyab de ji ma do tindu gyuba ta kokap mersta rangshin koran ani dinde ko di maina e kokap yue de bashi ta digi ngazo ku gyuba ta tindu gyuba ta yore yo mare se tindu gyuba ta yo ta me se 그래서 ta tanda pena nge tanda ngarang sem gyuba tang tugu yo mare 이내야 nge sem di tindu gyuba ta yore yo mare chiba dirta so tindu gyuba ta yore 가지란 tanda nge gyule ke di nge 차당 yullo dinzo semgi rangshin remendos semgi rangshin remendos 아니 텔레 도데 아니 지기 참바소라고도 제와소라고도 텔레 도데 로카로 튼든 칸 임바티 semgi rangshin resha di tendu deva soyeyo di tendu detugu res ine shembadi semlo tendu detugu res은 tendu detugu 말해서 코 매버 소투구 res다 김쟁 가르질라나 rangshin remendos 어디 시에고 왔다 된다 됐다.
So what I guess we have to try and figure out is what's being said, and therefore what we have to figure out is if something is not, then if there is a nature that is not its actual state or not its actual nature, then can that be removed or is it separable? Let's just call it that. This question is very different from saying, am I able to separate the two right now? They're two different questions. One is saying, is that nature separable from the thing? The other is, am I able to do it? For instance, if the nature of water is not hot, is it a nature that is separable from water? Now, whether I'm able to attain such a state where it is, but separable here means definitively separable, not just temporarily, right? So if its nature is to be definitively separable from being hot, that is what you're checking. You're not checking whether we have the means or the tools to make that nature of being hot definitively or permanently separated from water. Similarly, when this is what we're thinking of, similarly, if the nature of the mind is to not be defiled or not to have aversion, attachment, etc., and these are states that arise in the mind because of causes and conditions, then is it something that is permanently separable or permanently separable from the mind or not? Again, I might not be able to do it now, but is the nature of my mind one that can be permanently separated from these states if they have come about through later causes and conditions? So that's what we're trying to check over here.
Rwa, ta di na shin cheche, sheba gi suk zinye di, mebar sotu guru besla na, sheba gi pena takba zimba di mebar sotu guru la na, sotu gu maris. Karjin la na, takba di yu mubi nizure, sheba gi yu suk tongwa di, mubi nizu tonggu yore. Di indi sheba di gi suk tongya meju, san sotu gu maris. Yina ya sheba di gi, takwa tela duldu tongwa di mebar sotugu ruwesna di sotugu res. Karjin lana duldu tongya di takwa digi rangshin maare mayimba sonsa sheba digi dul tong diya di luburbi gyujin chigi tong diya res. Di indi ko gyudi kaaso na gyujin shemba di mebar sosna ani sheba di dul tongya mebar sotugu ruwesna di sotugu res. Odi labdi.
Similarly, can consciousness seeing form be separated from consciousness as a nature? And what's being said is it can't, because that is the nature, that's the actual nature of consciousness. Similarly, form being perceived by consciousness, can that be separated? Or can you attain a state where that never arises? And the answer is no, because a rope being seen as a rope and an eye consciousness seeing a rope is the nature of the eye consciousness, that is its actual nature. And the nature of the rope is, the actual nature of the rope is to be seen as a rope. But when the rope gets perceived as a snake, because there is some other condition that makes that happen, it is a nature that is separable, definitively separable, permanently separable. And the reason that it is permanently separable that is being given here is because it doing that thing or it perceiving it in that way is adventitious or it has arisen through some other causes.
Tadi tiwa di yang dindilang warda bena tiwa khadu tang yun nga zo karare. Sheba gi ani takwa sugdu tongwa di mebar suye yorbes. Tiwa dirda. Sheba gi takwa sugdu tongwa di mebar sotuye yorbes. Tiwa dir.
So the question is, can you make the mind not see? Again, but not see means take away the quality of seeing a rope to be form. Is that possible? Can you remove that quality from consciousness? Seeing rope as form.
Only mebar suye yorbes. Ta sheba digi takwa tela duldu tongwa di mebar suye yorbes. Tiwa dirda. Tiwa dingi dir.
And so then similarly the question is, but can you remake the quality or the state of seeing a rope as a snake? Can you separate that definitively from consciousness, that quality? Can you do that? That's the question.
O dire. Tai kisi di lendelra sheba gi ne takwa dela duldu tongwa mebar suye yore, takwa dela sugdu tongwa mebar suye yore. Takwa koro meta shana lana di lendi marda. Lendi marda.
If the answer is yes, you can do both because you can burn a rope. That's not the answer, okay?
Anta dila go marwa. Soza sheba dela sugdu tongwa di takwa la sugdu tongwa di sheba gi takwa la sugdu tongwa di mebar sotuye yo mare. Karchin mebar sotuye yo mare. Sugdu tongwa di sugdu tongwa gi sugdi yugi ngubi nizure. Yugi ngubi nizure yindi teta tumba sheba yulu shuge di sheba gi rangshin re. Di mebar sotuye yo mare. Ta takwa la duldu tongwa di mebar sotu gure. Kachilan takwa la duldu tongwa gi duldi takbe gi ngubi nizure mare. Mimba yindi 탁발로 두두 통 로디 매버 소투에 요레스 다 투사데 가리 투송 로디 매버 소에 요다 메디 가바 투송 로디기 유디 로디기 강다르 칸데 짐만한 신기 유디 ngo빈이 줄레 인더 민세 디간 게제시.
So similarly, if you cannot make the perception of a snake or the perception of form, so take when you have a rope, you can perceiving that rope as form and perceiving that rope as a snake, which one of these two can you separate from consciousness? That's what's being asked. And separate here is definitively. And what is suggested is seeing a rope as form is something that you cannot separate definitively from consciousness, because the nature of that rope is to be form. And so because the nature of form is inseparable from that rope, the perception of that rope as form is also inseparable from the nature of consciousness. But the perception of that rope as a snake, because it is not natural to the rope, and because it is not natural to perception, that perception of a snake can be separated from the rope, because it is not natural either to the rope and neither is it natural to consciousness. Which is why now the discussion about whether something is a nature that can be definitively separated or not, in terms of perceiving correctly and incorrectly, relies largely on whether it is the nature of the object to be in a way or not.
다 디나신 시제 셈디 다메 또바 그래서 다메 유디 제바 그래서 셈디 다메 유디 제바다 카체바 텐도 카체바 수에 여르스나 수에 요 마리스 가르친라나 유기 니루도 템바 슈기도 다메 통와디 유기 니루도 템바레샤스 다도 짐바디 다도 따와함 다도 짐바디 아니 셈테다 카체바 소투구르스나 소투구르스 다도 셈디 유텔라 다도 마다와 소투구르스 소투구르스 가진라나 그 다도 따와디 유기 무베니스도 툼바 슈 징기멘도스 로버 징기도스 바다 페딘도스 자르 당기 페디제 된디 자르.
So that's the example. Then the meaning is, can seeing selflessness be removed or separated from the mind? And the answer is no. The reason being, things are selfless. That is the nature of things. Seeing a self, since that is not the nature of things, is seeing the self separable. So is seeing selflessness a nature that is separable from the mind or not? And because selflessness is the nature of things, seeing selflessness is not something that can be definitively separated from the mind. Similarly, seeing a self being not the nature or not the real nature of things, the perception of a self, that is a nature that is definitively separable from the mind, because it is not natural to things. That's the example, and how the example is being used to show the ability of the mind to definitively remove self-grasping or not. And so then connecting the example to the meaning, the nature of mind is luminous and stains are adventitious.
제바 다메 또빌레 유기 니루도 툼버 짐바니 셈게 랑신타 셈테 테코나니 통외실 웨셀와 워스 다도 짐베 티만남니 유기 니루라 록버 짐베 셈도 지룽기 루브루와다 데 유기 테코나니 통와라 지비칠 멤바오스.
Apprehending an object by consciousness, realizing selflessness in accordance with how it exists, is the nature of mind. Because that mind sees reality, it is called luminous, so it is luminous. Since the stains that are self-grasping, and just to make this clear, it says grasping over here, but the word grasping is the same as apprehending, just not confuse you, yeah? Is that okay? Okay? So since the stains that are self-grasping or apprehending a self, apprehend an object incorrectly, they are adventitious and can be removed.
다 당다 델라 셈게 랑신 웨셀와 세게 웨셀 세게제 셰이스도와 다딕 ngazo 가르세나 왜여나 ngazo 수진 용어보든도 통통으로 봐 멤버여나 수진 용어보 통통으로 말이 딥기로 봐 디나신 다도 짐바디기 다기 니루 ngoma 통하라 딥기 요르와 디인디 당진들라 멤버스 다메 도비 셰럽디기 테니 유기 랑신 ngomadi 다기 니루 ngoma 통기 요바 인디 콜라 웨셀와스 다 콘 셰바 코란 딜 디시고 다 셈게 랑신 웨셀와 셰안 당진들라 멤버기 베자고로 가조 마리바텔라 멤버기 베자고로.
And then because it obstructs the reality of the object, it is dark. In many translations, you find light, clear light. But instead of using light, I've put luminous because I found luminous used in a more accurate sense. The idea here is if you say light, it might refer to, like, you could confuse it with that physical thing. What it's being compared to is it's luminous because luminosity or light has a luminous quality which illuminates things. It makes you see what it sees, what's there. Whereas when there's darkness that sets in, that darkness obstructs one from seeing what is actually there. And that's why here, the nature of mind is to see things as they are. That's why it's called luminous. Or that's why it's compared to being luminous. That's why it's given this quality of luminosity. Whereas self-grasping, because it's not seeing things as they are, and it's obstructing seeing the nature of how things are, it's compared to darkness over here.
Onnen dawa chabagi uma juba nalola. Timu ranshin dipchir kunzup des. So that timu saidi danzin tenzin keje sherwa. So that timu di kharchigor lega kharchigor sidu yugi ranshin thongala dibirchigi yudu timu ranshin dipchir kunzup des. Di labwa. O digi docho 안 timugi docho de kare. Dame to be sherab dirwa. Tongyu to be sherab dirwa. Digi ta yugi rangshin di chimachishin tongi yoba indu kanla ani kola ani tangi del timula rangshin dibas lawa indu sujo de la rangshin selwas keje de ledu di ani semge rangshin weselwas rangshin selwas rangshin weselwas e kowa dusle.
So Acharya Chandrakirti in his Madhyamika Avatara, when he speaks of what delusion is, delusion, which is another way of speaking of ignorance, he says, because delusion obscures or veils reality, it is called, this again is very weird English translation, it's called conventional, relative, etc. So what he's saying is, what the role of delusion is, or what ignorance does is, it veils, it conceals, it hides reality. And because the wisdom that realizes selflessness is the opposite of ignorance, what the wisdom of selflessness has as a quality is that it is luminous because it sees the reality. It sees reality, it sees how things actually are. So reality in English oftentimes is like some sort of very fancy kind of supra-mundane kind of reality. This is just very basic. It sees how things are. Ignorance obstructs the perception of how things are. So nature, reality, not in that kind of great elevated metaphysical sense, but just that's how things are.
So is
it clear, the example of luminosity and darkness?
selwa chinge direbe yugi ngobe nisu sel tungye gi wedan rawa direbe yang yugi ngobe nisu tongwala dibur chinge gi mumba da rawa chiba dirita.
So the question again then is the nature of the mind one that illuminates objects, and therefore does it have the quality of luminosity? Is that an inherent property of the mind, or is the inherent property of the mind one that conceals the nature of things, and therefore is the nature of the mind dark? Or is darkness an inherent property of the mind, or is luminosity an inherent property of the mind? That's the question.
Ta kisi yugi rangshin di mimba dan rawa yugi ngobu nisu tongwala dibur chingi di yina ta nga zu yugi ngobu nisu tongwala kale kazu gyamna negab madu ko tendu ngobu nisu tongwala dus detuwe di yungay yo marida. Kisi yugi ngobu nisu di kasa semgi ngobu nisu di semgi rangshin ngoma di yugi nilu tongwala dibur chingi di ma yinba yugi nilu sel tungi rangshin di yinba yina 아니 가서 민베차 디베차 그 루부르도 낑게 왕 흉대버티 매버스에 고갑이 요래 어디르다.
The point being, if the nature of the mind is to obscure, conceal, and therefore that quality of the mind that is inherent to it is a quality that is comparable to darkness, then the only kind of alternative left is to temporarily cultivate certain causes that allow the mind to see clearly. But it's always going to have to revert to that original state of it, which is one of darkness or one of concealing. If, however, the nature of the mind is not like darkness but is like luminosity, and therefore the mind's nature is luminous, then it perceiving things or its inability to see things clearly is something that can be worked upon because it has come about through causes, and therefore it's an adventitious quality of the mind. And therefore it is removable, entirely removable, because it is not an inherent quality of the mind.
소자다 ngazuegi semgi rangshindi 아니 민바나시 마인바치 유기 오븐드스 통통에기 외세베 랑신 외세와디 랑신 임바 인디 아니 ngazu 상게기 고갑요레스 넘버 탐지심바 이시귤레기 고갑두스 디 김생게 아니 semgi 랑신 외설와세 델라 아니 넘버 탐지심바 이시고도 치에기 사변 감대버시비 닝보 세지다 ngazu 상게기 릭 세지 ngazu 게지디 셰버다.
Which is why, or if and then because the mind's nature is luminous, we say that Buddhahood is possible. We say that this luminous nature of the mind is why attaining Buddhahood later is possible, and that's why this luminous nature of the mind is called Buddha nature, or the seed for Buddhahood, or the lineage of the Buddhas, referring to this luminosity.
다 단기 뒤원이부터 찍거리다. 셈기 유규고변에서 통화된 셈기 랑신레 유일 춘주로도 통화된 셈기 랑신레세기 뒤와 대당 셈기 랑신 유규고변에서 통화 여바된 셈기 랑신레베 유규고변에서 디베디 셈기 랑신레스. 다 셈카시기 고변에서 통화를 디ken기 셈이야 요래 빼나 단진다고. 양 고빈에서 통대ken기 셈이야 요래 빼나 담에도 셔럽다고. 다 셈 코랑기 랑신 고마 가리래. 유기 고빈에서 통해야지 고기 랑신레베 통투야지 고기 랑신레베 통화 책임이 랑신 대레베 양 단진 나신기 유기 고빈에서 통마주고 신 디버싱게 셈기 랑신레스. 다 티워지 땅. 당긴 것도 티워 땅만 하시 밀라 랑신 상와지 통해도 년바지 통해도 다 미코랑 랑신 고마 가리래. 라바나시 티워지지 사래.
So the question again, the original question, which was, is the nature of the mind to perceive accurately or apprehend accurately, or is the nature of the mind to apprehend inaccurately? Which one of these two is the nature of the mind? Is the same as saying, is the nature of the mind that of luminosity, which means that which clarifies, or is clarifies okay? Which clarifies objects? Can you say that? It's not the best, right? Which sheds light on objects. The idea is that it sees objects as they are, it perceives them accurately. So that's that luminous part of it. Or is the nature of the mind to conceal objects? So is it like darkness that conceals objects? Or is it like luminosity that sheds light on objects? It's the same question. And when you say the nature of the mind is this, of course, then when you say mind, there are certain states which are concealing, such as self-grasping. And then there are other states that are not concealing but are illuminating in that sense. And those are like the wisdom of selflessness. So because you can see these individual mental states, that's leading to the question, or that begs the question, which is, okay, because you have these different states individually, however, when you consider the mind itself, what is the nature of the mind, or what is the natural state of the mind? Is it one of concealing? Or is it one of illuminating? Is it one of shedding light on things? That question is like before, where you see people with good personality or with good characteristics, and you see people with harmful traits. But a human, what is the quality, what is the nature of a human? Is it a pure nature or is it a defiled nature? It's the same question.
다 자와 치마디기 가르친 거래. bedun tanda bedun ma jarche semge rangshin yese ba timanam ne lubu was tichir ngar yan nime nam teda gyurla chini mes ta digi kharsung gorsedu ngobin ju thongwa de semge rangshin da chinjulo du thongwa de semge rangshin mayin ba songza ani semge rangshin mayin bi lo digi semge rangshin gi lo tel nyu tugu meba soel so tugu mares reswa ta di semgi rangshin mayimba digi lo digi semgi rangshin yimbi yindigi chadila never sutuk maris nutuk maris ani semgi rangshin kari yimba ngobini su kari semgi rangshin ngoma kari yimba digi lo digi rangshin mayimba tela pa never sutuk res su never sutuk mari pa never sutuk res odiki shi.
Then the next verse, which is, therefore they were powerless even before, and they have no power later when it becomes its nature. What this is saying is, even before realizing selflessness, self-grasping did not have the ability to harm the nature of the mind, because the nature of the mind was not one of concealing or misapprehending. And so of the two natures that the mind has, the one of concealing or misapprehending or wrongly apprehending cannot harm the other nature of the mind, which is one of being luminous, of seeing, of apprehending correctly, because of these two, it is the second one which is being luminous, or the one that sees things as they are, that is the actual nature of the mind. So of these two natures, the one of concealing, or the one compared to darkness, cannot harm that other nature which is luminous, but the luminous nature can actually harm the other one. And that's why what is being said here is they were powerless even before.
semgi rangshin weche chir danjingi dame to be sherabla ngarnya nuba mela di labe di khari segor sidu chida danjin yona dame to be sherab nugruwa dame to be sherab kel nugruwa komutune nela nugruwa ine dame to be danjin digi danjin ngundu gyur danjin shukchumbu komba ina dame to be sherab kechuela nugre ina nugre te ine ya semdi dame ba tonga semgi dame ba tonya yuegi rangshin di meo sotuk mares o tilago rangshin tel kayen ne tu mares rangshin di meo sotuk mares.
So because in the commentary it says, because the nature of the mind is luminous, self-grasping did not have the power to harm the wisdom realizing selflessness even before. What this means is, while there is self-grasping, it prevents the mind from seeing selflessness, or it obstructs it. It harms the ability of the mind to see selflessness. But even though it's harming or obstructing the ability of the mind to see selflessness, the nature of that mind to be seeing selflessness, it cannot remove. It can't harm that nature of the mind's ability to see selflessness. That's not something that it can harm or remove.
Ta tanda nga zu semla danjin shukchumbu ki digi yo wa sonza tanda nga zu gi simgyu la dame to bi lo ke la ko gi gojin sugudu wa ine nga zu gi semdi dame thoya mebadi danjin khatsu mo khatsu gomshanar ke ba ni ke ba danjin gomsha ba ina danjin digi semtela dame thoya gi nubat meba sere slaiji yorubesla na ti yo marta.
Which is why what is being said is, even if from infinite lives there has been this kind of very strong, overpowering almost familiarity with believing that there is a self, and so self-grasping has this kind of very thick, dense fog that it has created in the mind, and that has been going on for very long, has this quality of self-grasping, of darkness, of concealment. Has it been able to affect the nature of the mind, that is its ability to perceive selflessness? The answer is no. It has never been able to affect that. It has never been able to compromise that ability.
Te mena rangshin di gyuwa tang tyoge nuba mena semgi dame thoya la semgi dame thoya ge rangshin yue deba rangshin di meba sotugu meba ina ngari nugu meba ina ani chiso dame kom danzi kewa mangbo koma nashin dame gyurungbu komche ani nigyu tarchin sona 딘디기 니규 타진비 셈 담에도 쉐라 텔라 아니 컨디션이 단징 양결 텔라 양결 단징 너바 컨디션 제도 제투야 거려 말이스 디인디 되면은 치수 니규 타르시네 셈 담에도 쉐라기 당유도 규발라 너비 누바 치더여디 메토스 디 디지르가리 누메남 대다귤라 치뉴메 소티송겨.
So if it has never been able to influence or act upon the nature of the mind, even in states when there was no wisdom realizing selflessness, when that is cultivated, when that is realized and then that is cultivated to a similar extent, at that point, then when it further goes through a state of final transformation, how could it possibly affect its nature then? If it was unable to do it before, when it has been realized, cultivated, and there has been final transformation, how could it act upon it then? So that's the second part which says, and they have no power later when it becomes its nature. So if it was unable to do so before, later when there is final transformation and the mind becomes the nature of wisdom realizing selflessness, how could it have the power to harm it? It cannot. Therefore, a mind that has been entirely transformed by the wisdom realizing selflessness does not have the power to produce any faults.
딱 가지기 니규 타르진 비셈라 녀바기비 누바두 가르치 라바이나 다음에 무슨도 통상의 강사기 줄라 라리양 아니 녀바 차수께 통양도 와스 딱 가지기 삼로 티르다 가지기 삼로 테러와 디통네 아니 가지기 딜랍기였다.
And so then now the opponent or the person who this discussion is being had with, they now say, no, that's not really true. It does return, because even when you have direct realization of it, you find it coming back. And therefore, this final transformation that you claim will inhibit or will completely eradicate the possibility of self-grasping arising. That's not possible, because after having direct realization of it, it still comes back.
딱 가지기 남의 웃음도 통소나 니규 타진 삼로 고기요래. 남의 웃음도 통상의 강사기 줄라 아니야 라양 당진다 라양 녀바 차수 끼기요 통윤도 아니 니규 타르친 바이네 라양 녀바 끼기도 삼거 요르데 랑루 가르세고래 남의 웃음도 또바 잠기 니규 타르친 바기 시기요 말이스. 그래서 남의 웃음도 통상의 강사기 줄라야 당진의 녀바 차수 끼와 요르스는 요래. 남의 웃음도 통하니 니규 타르친 바 고와 말이스. 니규 타르친 바체 말이스. 어디 자와 치머디다 숨거 요래. 뉴에 나야 네바지 기능인고 정을 윤도 니니 요면데 살륜라는 메시노 오세 자와들 lep시.
So the thinking of that person here is they're equating final transformation with direct realization of selflessness. And because after having direct realization of selflessness, there are states of self-grasping that arise, they're saying when you reach final transformation, you still see states of self-grasping, and therefore the wisdom of selflessness, when it has reached final transformation or undergone final transformation, it's not true that it does not allow for self-grasping to arise. And the answer here is, what you're calling final transformation, which is direct realization of selflessness, is not actual final transformation. That state of final transformation is still later. So in response to their objection, which is actually with an inaccurate identification of what final transformation according to the Acharya Dharmakirti's position is, he says, even if the power were there, because its essential nature has the power to adversely affect it, it will not remain for long. So it cannot remain for long like fire on wet earth.
So that 니규 타르친 비셈디 가두레스 라바이나 대방 웃음도 통, 남의 웃음도 통. 통신 라리안 남의 웃음도 양내 곰체 아니 딜 림바 게체자. 림바 구체자. 먼저 골람 꼴 구세다. 빵자 공방 꼴구 뽕지기 예보 골람 꼴 구세제. 림바 구디 림기 바친제 타마텔라 도제다부 띵인 진세제 되게 아니 녀몽 다 중쇼유디 녀몽 중무기들이 사빈 차쇼디 빵두지 신이 니주 타친 바스 게지시기 열마도 딩외라 니주 타진 베게 시기 요 말이스. 어디래?
So then what do we mean? What is our way of understanding final transformation? Final transformation is after having directly realized selflessness with repeated familiarization with this direct realization of selflessness, it is said that there are 9 more states which are known as the 9 levels or 9 stages of the path of meditation. And each one of these 9 stages has its own appropriate, I guess, afflictive state that it abandons up until the very 9th state where there's something known as Vajra-like Samadhi. And then that Vajra-like Samadhi has the ability to eradicate or uproot the smallest or the last remaining affliction and its seed, which is then in the next moment what becomes final transformation. So when we say final transformation, that's what it means.
다 딘디 니주 타신바 텔라 아니 녀바산기에 요 말이스. 단다 케랑기 셰디 얘기더니 니주 타신바 단다 케랑기 사모당 얘기더니 로바파고 데몽 무슨 통등이 된줄라 니주 타신바 마임바 송자 된주기 줄라 아니 가래래 녀바 착수 기기레스. 녀바 착수 기기 니바 조메바 인디 기기레스. 기기레데 이나야 딘디기 녀바 착수 단당 안서 줄이 깨버나시 유rum부 깨버든데 요르베스는 요 말이스. Pena sa lumba le me parba yena me barba yena ya sa di lumba yimbi chani me di shukchimbo maba ya du gyurungu ba ma tu ya de ne kebar duwas sa lunla ne meshinos petitiondu dame ngusum du thong komdigi yoba yindi nyeba chaksu keba yena sa lumba le me barba na shi shuk mejo gyurungu ne ma tu ba dindi re ma do ko mutune nyeba chaksu kedi ngu yo mares odisungi yor.
And so what you claim to be final transformation is actually not final transformation. But even those who have attained such a state of direct, I guess, perception or insight or realization of selflessness, even though they have self-grasping, unlike us, it doesn't remain for extended periods of time, nor does it remain in a state of heightened intensity. For example, when you have wet earth, you can try and light a fire on it and you might succeed, but that fire, because the earth that it is resting on is wet, will never become very big, and neither will it be able to remain for a long time. Similarly, someone who has direct realization of selflessness, self-grasping and the faults that arise from self-grasping may come about, but they won't be very intense, and neither will they remain for extended periods of time.
Deba ni yu tar machimbi loba phagbe semla nyeba chaksu gebe nyuba yona yang yu ringdu nebe nyuba yoba mayinde nyeba thela nyeba jingi nyimbu kinyu jing yimbi chers pena salomba la me yundu mineba shino.
The commentary is the minds of Aryas in training who have not reached final transformation, even though they have imprints that have the power to give rise to faults, the faults cannot remain for long, because their essential state has the power to produce an antidote that adversely affects the faults. It is like fire that is unable to remain for long on wet earth.
Ta di kechumbu shira chaga yore lobtsin tanda dintri ngadu jojedi semge rangshin kariresha se siju tanya pe kechumbu chaga yore digi thone ta yuwa tanya yoda me dini tha choyor ta rangshin yuwa tanya meju jiyinba ina 다 고 내가 사모다에 대가랑 레마도 디니 파시라시를 로서스케 요마 랑과 고노케 요마레 랑신 딘디 민바이나 ngazo 고급 비열다 타르바토요 고급 비열에 상게 고급 비열 디인디 심게 랑신 고마 카레 세주 당에디 개춤부레.
So what we've done or what we've covered today is amongst the various things, it's especially significant because what it's addressing here is trying to see what the nature of the mind is. And if the nature of something is unchangeable, then you really don't have much hope to do something other than work on it for short periods of time, but its nature itself will eventually manifest. And so you can't do much to alter it. If the nature, however, is not to be like that, then you can act on it, and then there is hope for acting on it and removing it. So this discussion of what the nature of the mind is particularly significant, because if the nature of the mind is to have self-grasping or not to have self-grasping, then becomes essential and fundamental in trying to understand for oneself whether liberation is possible or not, or whether attaining Buddhahood is possible or not. It really does lie, it kind of depends entirely on this nature of the mind, what that is.